Okay, so with this video, I'd like to summarize the process of respiration for you, run through the basics right from breathing all the way down through what controls, how we control breathing. It's all the same stuff we've done in class, but just in case you missed some of it or you want to hear it again, it's here. All right. So remember the first big concept we talked about with regards to breathing is the idea of the atmospheric pressure, and then we got this naturally we have this nice balance between the air that wants to come in this way and inflate the lungs, and then the same pressure that's squeezing the lungs. Okay, so what we got to do is we got to alter that pressure, and for our breath in, what we want to do is remove some of this pressure. If we can reduce this pressure, and this atmospheric pressure stays the same, then the lungs will inflate. Okay, so for a normal breath, okay, which is what we have down here, for a normal breath, all we do is contract the diaphragm. Remember, the diaphragm is normally kind of dome-shaped, curved up here. So when it contracts, it pulls down and away. And that means the lungs are squeezed less, and then the air pressure is stronger, the atmospheric pressure is stronger than the pressure squeezing the lungs, so the lungs inflate. Okay? For a deep breath, we're going to still use the diaphragm. That's always going to be involved when we're breathing in. But now we're going to use the external intercostal muscles. Okay, so we're actually going to lift the ribs up and off. Remember, intercostal means between ribs, and the external ones are on the outside, so they can lift the ribs up and off the lungs. Okay, and that means there's even less pressure squeezing the lungs, so even more air comes in here. Okay. For breathing out, for a normal breath out, all we got to do is relax stuff. Okay, your lungs are kind of elastic. Your organs, all these organs, your stomach and everything down here got squished when that diaphragm contracted and pushed down on it. So this will, what we refer to as the elastic recoil, is just the fact that these organs kind of bounce back into place, squish the diaphragm back into place, and that's going to squeeze the lungs and squeeze air up and out. Okay. If you use the external intercostals, if you just relax them, they kind of bounce back into their normal spot. Okay. If we want to force air out, we want to scream or yell or do something a lot more forceful. Okay. Then we use we're going to use the internal intercostals, so they're on the inside of the ribs, right? And they pull the ribs down and in, so they're going to yank these ribs down and in, squeezing the lungs, okay? And if we squeeze the abs, we contract these abs, we generate more force up this way into the diaphragm and on the bottom of the lungs, and that's going to force more air out. So when we breathe in, really, we're breathing in so that we can deliver air down into these little air sacs. So at the end of your lungs, you've got these little alveoli, the very tips of the airways. The alveoli, each little air sac looks like this. And what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in on the wall of one of these. We're going to zoom in kind of like right here in the next picture, so we can actually see what's going on. All right. So here is the air on this side, and here's the blood. And what has to happen here is diffusion. Just like we talked about in class, we need oxygen to kind of diffuse this way, and we need CO2 to diffuse out. Okay, and if we get that, then we've done what we're supposed to do in there. Okay, remember that it happens. This is called the respiratory membrane. This little chunk right here is called the respiratory membrane. It is super thin. Okay, really, really, really thin. Okay. Huge amount of surface area, so this diffusion takes place very, very, very quickly. In fact, it takes only about a quarter of a second for us to actually have all this oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse and reach equilibrium. So let's talk a little bit what happens to that oxygen. So when that oxygen diffuses in, okay, when oxygen diffuses in, about 10% of it dissolves in the plasma, but most of it is going to bind to hemoglobin. That's what this graph is actually trying to show us here. So this is the percent saturation of hemoglobin, right? And this is the pressure, okay? So in the lungs, the pressure is about 104. So we should get almost 100% saturation. Be right up here, about 100% saturated. In a healthy lung, when the blood leaves the lungs, it should be about 100% full. Remember, each hemoglobin carries about 4 molecules of oxygen. There's 280 of those molecules per red blood cell, so we can carry a lot of oxygen in there, and it should leave 100% full. When we come back, the PO2 is usually right around 40. Okay, so this is our PO2 when we come back from the body. So we've made a trip, we've delivered oxygen to the lung, to the, say, toes, and it comes back from the toes. It's usually still about 3/4 full. Okay, and we talked about the fact that that's important because it allows us to carry extra. On a normal trip, we only have to drop off about a quarter of the oxygen from each hemoglobin, but not always normal, right? We can hold our breath, we can start running, we can do lots of things that require more oxygen. And that's what this process shows us. This is the oxidation saturation curve. Right? And over here, this was the idea of the Bohr shift. And the Bohr shift is all about how do we drop off that extra. Normal trip, we only drop off a quarter of the oxygen. How do we drop off the extra? So if the blood flows into an area that's acidic, okay, the effect of pH, right? So we become acidic. All of a sudden, instead of coming back 75% full, we would now come back 60% full. So we just dropped off an extra 15% from that. Okay. Also, if you get into an area where it's using a lot of carbon dioxide quicker, this number might drop. This is how much. This is the pressure, the amount of CO2. So you might slide further that way. And temperature. If you increase the temperature, so instead of normally being right around here, okay, if you increase the temperature, that causes it to drop off more. If you combine all of that, we can drop off much more oxygen than the quarter of the oxygen that we normally do. Okay. Why is that significant, guys? Remember, pH is usually going to be increased because of the lactic acid and the CO2, the carbon that becomes carbonic acid, and the increased temperature comes from cell respiration. So what these two things really indicate, increased temperature and a drop in pH, indicate there's lots of cell respiration going on. To keep that cell respiration happening, we need to drop off more oxygen. Okay, so the Bohr shift is really handy that way. It drops off extra oxygen where we need it for more cell respiration. All right, CO2 is really easy. So CO2 is going to diffuse from the tissues into the bloodstream. So it diffuses in. About 7% dissolves in the plasma, the watery portion of the blood. 23% is going to bind to the hemoglobin. 70% gets converted into carbonic acid, right? So it's converted into carbonic acid, and it travels around the body. When it gets to the lungs, we just reverse this whole process, so it converts back into CO2 that we can actually exhale out of the lungs. So carbon dioxide transport, super easy. 7% dissolved, 23% bound to hemoglobin. Remember, different binding spots on the hemoglobin, but still binding the hemoglobin, and 70% converted to carbonic acid. The last part of respiration is the gas exchange at the cells. So at the cells, we're going to have our second diffusion. Okay, so let's put it all together here. Here comes the blood coming back from the body. It's pretty low in oxygen, pretty high in CO2. So oxygen diffuses in, CO2 leaves. We're 100% saturated in oxygen. It starts going around the body. Let's say it gets into your leg. Okay. In your leg, we're going to drop off oxygen. It's going to diffuse from the blood to the tissues, and the CO2 is going to diffuse from the tissues back into the blood, and you'll see those numbers that we end up with over on this end. So now it's going to flow all the way around the body and back to the lungs, so we can do this whole process. All right. So it's just diffusion at the cells. Just diffusion at the cells. Remember that if for some reason this area is warm or acidic, we'll diffuse more oxygen, obviously. And if this cell is going through more cell respiration, you're going to have more CO2 diffuse out. But that's the basic idea, guys. Just diffusion at the cells. So then the last part we want to talk about is how we actually control breathing. Remember, we got two big areas. We've got the pneumotaxic area, the pons, and then you got the rhythmicity area, the medulla. So this area actually receives all the input about our body's pH, all sorts of stuff. It's going to our pattern of breathing, how loud we want to be. All the information kind of comes in here, and then it passes the signal on to what we need. So if we only need the diaphragm, we only send the signal to the dorsal group, and then that dorsal group sends the signal onto the diaphragm. We contract, nice, normal, shallow breathing. If we need deeper breathing, we send the signal to the dorsal and the ventral. And the ventral is going to control all those external and internal intercostal muscles. Remember, the diaphragm is going to always be involved. So shallow breathing and deep breathing involves the diaphragm. And the last bit is, how do we know whether we want to breathe faster or slower? Well, it all has to do with pH and really carbonic acid. So if we start running, we go through more cell respiration. That makes more CO2, and we would become acidic. Okay, we'd start making too much carbonic acid, and we would become acidic. And to fix that problem, so we're here, we breathe faster, and that gets rid of more CO2. Happens to bring in some more oxygen. Pretty cool. Okay, if we are low in CO2 because for whatever reason, or we're basic. Okay, for whatever reason, all we have to do is slow down our breathing. That means we'll hold on to more CO2. So we decrease our breathing, hold on our CO2, and that will fix our pH. Okay? Where is this measured? Well, it's measured by the central chemoreceptors. That's a phrase you want to know come time for the test. And they're located in the cerebrospinal fluid, right around your brain and spinal cord. Pretty handy spot to measure things. Right? We also have a couple other receptors, but we're not going to focus much on those guys. It's really these central chemoreceptors that are an important part. All right? So putting it all together, you've got the central chemoreceptors monitoring your body's pH. If we become acidic, that's telling us we've got more cell respiration going on. We're making more CO2. So we increase our breathing. We do that by the pneumotaxic area sending signals down to the dorsal group to breathe faster, and probably down to the ventral group as well. In the end, what that results in is that we start to breathe faster. Right? The diaphragm's going to come down faster. It's going to let more air in. We'll probably also use the external intercostal muscles. That's going to bring more air down into these alveoli, increase this exchange across the respiratory membrane, and we can then deliver more oxygen to the cells as we go around the body. Remember, when it gets to the cells, all it is simple diffusion. All we're going to do is diffuse the stuff across that membrane, and that's kind of the whole process, guys. Hopefully that helps. See you in class.